Hello folks, Scotty.
Yes, Scotty is back making a fool of himself. The funny thing is that he never really argues that democratic socialism is an oxymoron. He spends most of his video describing pre-Thatcherite Britain as a communist state.
To say that I never made the argument clear on why democratic socialism is an oxymoron is a fallacy in itself. In the video, I pointed out examples of pre-Thatcher Britain because the fact that was the prolonged testing of democratic socialism. Nowhere, however, did I state that Britain before Thatcher was largely communist. No, I said Britain had ticked off at least 7 out of 10 of the Communist Manifesto planks and more or less was going down that road. In other words, it's the path towards communism. I also stated about the historical example of Venezuela. The same Venezuela who took on democratic socialism and dropped from 99th on the Freedom Index, and as if by magic, they were sitting 174th on the Freedom Index by 2013 when Hugo Chavez had passed away.
This is absolute nonsense. State-owned industries employed 30% of the workforce and accounted for only 10% of Britain's GDP. Yet Scotty M thinks that the private sector was about to be abolished before Thatcher came to power.
See, the problem with his argument is this.
The extent of nationalisation under both Labour and Tory governments was breathtaking. The ports and the docks and shipbuilding were nationalised. The trains and the railways, freight transport, canals, ferries and buses were nationalised. The airports and airlines, car, bus, truck and airplane manufacturing, the coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, the steel industry, iron, water, electricity were all nationalised. Telecommunications were nationalised. Much of the computer industry, radio and television were nationalised. The government even took over some pubs and the travel agent Thomas Cook. Britain, once the world's leading capitalist industrial nation, became one of the most state-owned of any country outside the communist world.
So yes, of course it was heavily state-owned, and of course it is the private sector that finances the public sector. Now that's the very reason why by the 1970s Britain was in such a financial mess.
You might wake up in the morning and brush your teeth with state water, get into your state-produced car, avoiding state-produced lorries and buses. You might pick up your state telephone, phone the state travel agent, book a holiday taking off from a state airport in a state-produced aircraft, and so it went on. You could go through the entire day without ever contacting the free enterprise side of the economy.
Because it cannot sustain heavy nationalisation, and that's exactly what Britain was faced with.
This is not only idiotic, but also has nothing to do with the topic. Scotty M is supposed to be explaining to us why democratic socialism is an oxymoron.
Well, I've already explained why democratic socialism is an oxymoron. It's an oxymoron simply because of what we call the economic calculation problem. And I provided a separate video on the economic calculation problem. Now, what I stated was the very fact that regardless, irrespective of whether you support, workers' control of the means of production, or even workers' ownership of the means of production, or maybe you want to talk about state ownership of the means of production, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, what you're faced with is the price mechanism problem. And what that simply means is, once you're faced with the economic calculation problem, you don't know how much to produce, you don't know what to produce, you don't know where to allocate the valuable scarce resources, you don't even know what to invest more in. Therefore, in every case and throughout recorded history of what we've seen in practice from your democratic socialism, all we've ever seen is the example of waste, shortages, and of course, a self-serving government.
Scotty has the gall to claim democratic socialism is an oxymoron whilst attacking free education, which is one of the key characteristics of a democratic education system.
The problem with your argument on the free education is not so much to do with costs, however, it's not free. And of course it is more expensive, but it's all in relation to do with the broken window fallacy, something such as yourself would not understand because you have to take from elsewhere in order to pay for it. Of course that's a whole argument on itself, but The main reason why I do not support the free education system is because I support a system where kids have choice. In other words, a system of freedom, a system under the free market. That's what I support. And no, it does not mean to say that it's only affordable for the rich. This is something you just make up in your head, just to suit your own agenda. You clearly don't understand anything. It's a bit like the time you tried to say your NHS was somehow more affordable than free market healthcare, and more garbage. And no, the United States of America has not seen free market healthcare since prior to the year 1904. But you see, all of these things are just things which you choose to ignore. And you always try to change the subject. You're talking about free education here. One, it's not free, and two, the very problem is the fact that you have put a monopoly in the hands of the state, and you trust the state with all of that information that kids are fed with.
Socialism is an economic system that advocates for the collective and democratic control and ownership of the means of production. You, Scotty, on the other hand, want all the power focused in the hands of a few capitalists. The anti-democratic one here is you.
And in some dictionaries it may say that it's state ownership or control of the means of production. In some others it will come out and say that it's in the hands of the community as a whole. But it really does not matter. And the reason it does not matter is because, again, you're faced with the economic calculation problem. In other words, it wouldn't matter what you argue for. Once you're faced with the economic calculation problem, you do not know the needs and wants of the people. How can you if you don't know what to produce more of? If you don't know how much to produce? You don't hold that information. But then you went on to redefine the entire meaning of capitalism just to suit your own agenda. Absolutely ridiculous. No, a free market is not a system whereby it's all in the hands of the few and therefore you're subservient to that. No, corporatism's not capitalism. No, corporatism is not the early stages of capitalism. In fact, the reason why corporatism formed was all because of your state interference, because of your socialism.
Thatcher was the most incompetent British Prime Minister in history. She inherited a massive oil boom, but blew it on tax cuts for the wealthy, and the massive unemployment queues.
Margaret Thatcher was the most incompetent British leader in British history, really. She took over one of the most financially difficult periods in British history. I don't think you even begin to understand. Mind you, you were the same person who tried to blame Margaret Thatcher for the unemployment rate. No surprise, and that's why you've brought this up. You've brought this up as if to try and blame Margaret Thatcher for the unemployment rate. As I've mentioned before, the recession that happened in 1978 happened before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. And what proves that you don't even understand what a recession is a recession is where the economy grinds to a halt and productivity levels drastically decrease. As a result of that, there's a shortage of productivity, therefore the costs soar through the roof. And because the costs soar through the roof, businesses are forced to cut back. Businesses are forced to scale down. And when, the prices soar and consumers are spending less, of course, people are being paid off. That's why you saw the high unemployment rate. But how convenient of you to ignore the trade union congress that was not only bombing businesses and industry with high tax rates in order to fund the remaining workers in those industries, you ignore the very fact that the trade union congress blackmailed non-union members that if they do not become union members, they will not find work with any of them. And what happened? In Margaret Thatcher's third term as Prime Minister, she kicked the trade union congress in the teeth and it created 3 million plus jobs. Isn't it simply magical that you ignore that fact? Isn't it simply magical how you ignored the entire argument on the democracy issue, ignoring the very fact that democratic socialism led India into a dictatorship by the 1970s? Instead of actually touching upon that argument, you touch upon Margaret Thatcher and try to change the entire subject to something about Margaret Thatcher and unemployment rates. No surprise.
Look at this chart here. This is North Sea oil production. This is what I think saved Britain. If you could see from the chart, oil production from the North Sea oil came online as she became prime minister and started to continue to climb up through her prime ministership. The fact is, the media never talks about it. They act as if she delivered some sort of miracle, that somehow out of nowhere, a druid ritual perhaps, that they became magically wealthy by her deregulating the financial markets here at the same time.
In that video, she hits out and says that Margaret Thatcher unleashed deregulation. Let me quote this for you, as Philip Booth at the IEA points out. In his own words, he says, the 1980s was not a period of financial deregulation. Insider trading was made illegal in 1980. The life insurance industry, which had been almost free of regulation for over 100 years from 1870, was re-regulated from 1980 to 1982. Bank deposit insurance was introduced in 1979. The sale of investment and insurance products came under statutory regulation from 1986. Further, the first ever regulation of UK bank capital took place under Basel I, agreed while Thatcher was Prime Minister. That goes to show you the level of ignorance from herself.
Once again, Scotty M provides no sources to back up his claims. He never does. The truth is that Venezuela is still a parliamentary democracy.
A parliamentary democracy, he says. Yeah, what choice they have. What great democracy they have. Democracy between one socialist and another socialist. Yeah, that's some democracy, that is. That's some choice. Such democracy to the point that they were forced onto the centralised agriculture. But isn't it simply magical that you ignore the fact that they went from 99th on the Freedom Index to 174th? Isn't it simply magical that they have all the food shortages, they had all the blackouts? But that's right. We'll just ignore the fact that it was all because of socialist government price controls that caused that, yeah. We'll just ignore that fact, and of course, we'll continue to try and blame the United States desperately and religiously.
The truth is, Scotty, that capitalists have been the worst enemies of democracy in that part of the world for a while. That is understandable. They hate democracy in the workplace, so why would they support parliamentary democracy?
To say that that part of the world is where capitalists have abused the people is complete erroneous nonsense, because they were not capitalists, they were anti-capitalists, they were corporatists. To call a corporatist a capitalist is erroneous just because he's a business owner or just because they support certain level of the private sector or whatever. To call a corporatist anything capitalist is an erroneous argument, because to support capitalism is to support the market's freedom from government. To say that corporatists support the freedom of the economy from government is itself an erroneous argument.
Well, if we use your own example, yes. Britain did not become a totalitarian society under left-wing Labour governments. In fact, Thatcher was far more dictatorial because she used the state to beat the trade unions into submission, which you clearly approve of. You are a joke, Scotty, and you always will be.
You call me a joke, but throughout the entire video you miss the main argument. And the main argument is economic calculation problem. There's the problem. There's what you ignore. The reason why democratic socialism cannot be democratic, the reason why is simply because how the hell can you serve people's needs and wants if you're faced with the economic calculation problem and you do not know the people's needs and wants? If you don't know what to produce, if you don't know how much to produce, if you don't know where to allocate scarce resources, if you don't even know what to invest more in, how can you serve the people's needs and wants?